Well, good evening and welcome. We're going to get started because we have a number of people joining on Zoom, and we need to get folks in here to take their seats. We already have more than 60 people who have joined the Zoom aspect of this hybrid program. But for those of us who are here in person, it is absolutely wonderful that we're about 25 or 30 and with more coming in. It is so great to see people in person and to have some conversations. I'm here just to provide a quick welcome. The Newark History Society is really pleased tonight that we have both NJPAC and the Newark Public Library co-sponsoring this program. We are attempting to do this on a hybrid basis. It's an experiment every time. So if you find something that we could do better, those of you who are joining us via Zoom or those of you in person, please let me know and we'll try to incorporate it next time. I am just, we still have a couple of people coming in, but I'm going to introduce Michelle Rotunda of Union County College and our executive committee of the Newark History Society to introduce our speaker tonight. Q&A will be done both in person and online. I will be checking questions that come into the chat or the Q&A function and then relaying them. We're going to try to alternate between in-person and virtual. But if you're joining us via Zoom, write your questions into the chat or the Q&A and we'll come to them at the end of the program. But Michelle?
Hello, it's so nice to be here. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening. Neil Maher is a professor of history in the Federated History Department at the New Jersey Institute of Technology and Rutgers University at Newark, where he teaches environmental, political, and environmental justice history of the United States. His books include Nature's New Deal, published by Oxford University Press in 2008, which received the Charles A. Weyerhaeuser Book Award for the best monograph in conservation history, and Apollo in the Age of Aquarius, published in 2017 by Harvard University Press, which was named a Choice Outstanding Title, a Bloomberg View must-read book, and a Smithsonian Best Book. Maher's writings also appeared in popular media, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Yes Magazine, among others. For the 2022-23 academic year, he'll be a resident fellow at the New York Public Library's Dorothy and Lewis B. Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers in Manhattan, where he'll be researching and writing an environmental justice history of Newark, New Jersey. There's actually a lot more I could say, but personally, I'm going to put a plug in for his website, neilmaher.com, which has loads of really interesting articles, podcasts. I was really kind of blown away by it, so I do want to mention that. But tonight, like the rest of you, I'm eager to learn about Newark's beer industry, so I'll turn it over to Neil Maher.
Just spilt my water. First thing I do is come up here and spill my water. Thank you so much, Michelle. Oh, is that better? Okay. It's so good to see people in person again. Thank you so much for coming out. But please stay safe, stay healthy. But it's just great to be able to come together again. I want to thank Michelle for that wonderful introduction, really generous, and also for her own work on alcohol in America, which is very related to the talk tonight. I want to thank Natalie Borisevitz, who I don't think is here, but maybe she's watching, reference librarian at Rutgers, who has helped my students for 4 or 5 years with their own research on the history of Newark. And she's the one that reached out to ask me if I could come and talk here. And it's just so great to be able to pay back a little bit for the work that she's done. I want to thank Tim Christ for organizing the event and keeping me on target, keep me on message here, and also for all of the work he's done for the Newark Historical Society. And I also want to give a plug out to George, Holly, and Nancy Zach, who have worked with me a lot in the past, but even tonight, right before I got up here, came in and were giving me documents. I mean, both of them came with really important documents about my talk that hopefully we can discuss in the Q&A, because they shift a little bit what I might say. So that's always exciting when the history changes right before you go up to give the talk. And then most importantly, I want to thank all of you, both online and who are here in person. It's a really tough time, and I just really appreciate you coming out to listen to me and also to learn about Newark's history. So are we good? Yeah, so let's just jump right in. I want to begin at the end, or one of the ends, the closing of the Pabst Brewery in 1985. This was a really sort of iconic image here of the Pabst Brewery being demolished. Most importantly, that giant beer bottle, which I think was a water tank on the top, being taken off and taken apart and supposedly stored somewhere. And it closed its doors, and it left only the Anheuser-Busch brewery left in Newark, which is surprising because exactly 100 years ago, in 1885, there were 26 commercial breweries in Newark. New Jersey was the 7th largest beer producer as a state in the United States, producing 2.5 million barrels of beer a year. And many of you know the big five Newark breweries: Ballantine, which is of course the most famous; the Kruger Brewery, known for canning beer, the first brewery to can beer; Feigenspahn, which is known for PON. Do you all know what PON stands for? Pride of Newark, exactly, there you go. Maher, and then finally the Hensler Brewery. So it's just interesting to think about the golden era of Newark brewing, when these were so robust and so economically viable. And then 100 years later, we have the fall of beer making in Newark. And the usual arguments are twofold, pretty much. One is prohibition. Prohibition destroyed the Newark breweries. Here we see a picture of beer kegs being destroyed in the Meadowlands in 1925, and an anti-prohibition march in 1932 with the Kruger truck being used as a prop to get Franklin Roosevelt to get in office and repeal the Volstead Act, the 18th Amendment. And the other argument is that it was the prohibition followed by the Great Depression, which hurt the beer industry in Newark. We see a bank run in Newark in 1936 and an unemployment line in Newark in 1935. The idea here being that if you didn't have money in a bank or you didn't have a job, you couldn't buy much beer. So that obviously hindered the beer industry. There are some problems with these arguments, though. And let's just go back to these five. Well, the Windermere Brewery did close during Prohibition. Most Newark breweries did not. They made it through, and they made it through quite well. The Hensler Brewery closed in 1958 after 98 years of production. The Kruger Brewery closed in 1961 after 103 years of production. And the Ballantine Brewery, which bought Feigenspahn in 1944, didn't close until 1965, after 125 years of producing beer in Newark. So this brings us back to the question, why did Newark's beer run dry? When I started looking for answers I went to advertisements because they're fun. They're fun to look at, they're fun to watch, they're fun to think with. And one I found that was particularly useful for me as an environmental historian, I'm gonna show you now. And I thought I would just take a minute to explain what an environmental historian is. So we're all pushed to specialize. So if you're interested in workers, you become a labor historian. If you're interested in politics, you become a political historian. Environmental historians are interested in the relationship between nature and society and how that relationship changes over time. So how, for instance, nature affects history, maybe how rivers affect settlement patterns in colonial America, to the other side of it, how society affects the natural environment. So development and economic development causing pollution. That's the relationship we look at. So when I saw this ad as an environmental historian, I thought, there's something here that I want to explore more. So let's take a quick look at an ad from 1960 for Ballantine. Oh, it's not the volume. I'll go back. You got to get the volume on. Want me to try again? We're having technical difficulties. Please stand by. Shall I try one more time? Okay. Now my clicker's not working. We have to watch it. It's sort of key to the whole. We'll get it. Okay, ready? It worked before. We tested it.
Popular? You bet. This is today's Ballantine beer. Crisp, clean, naturally more refreshing.
So what can we talk about? Let's talk about, we're good. Okay, let me go back. You want me to try it or? Okay. So I've been teaching at NJIT in Rutgers, Newark for 20 years. Another website I want to pitch is a website I created with my students titled, well, its address is ejhistory.com. And that's where you'll find a lot of student work on environmental justice issues, ejhistory.com. And some of them have looked at breweries. So. Oh, we can probably just look at it. I can talk you through it. They're claiming how wonderful the beer is.
This is today's
and they're talking about
Crisp,
why it's
clean,
so special.
naturally
And
more
what they do
refreshing.
is you'll see
The only
they
beer,
cut from the
golden
bar
mellow
and
from
they
the
tell you about
golden
the
harvest.
incredible
This is the
grain
golden
that's
harvest.
being used
Grains
that goes
carefully
into
grown and
and
selected.
how it's very, very special.
And this is the
We
golden
talk about the
harvest.
hops, how the
Costlier.
hops stays on the plant for 2 weeks longer to make it more aged and give that beer a certain special something. And then they cut back to the bar. It looks like it's frozen. They cut back to the bar and they sit there and drink and enjoy the wonderful beer. So as an environmental historian, I thought this is perfect. This just feeds right into my interest and it uncovers this environmental role played by nature that has not been examined. So I thought I want to use the ad to push me to explore what I'm thinking of as the environmental history of beer.
Premium hops that are mellowed 2 weeks
See,
longer on the
mellowed
vine
2 weeks
than the hops
longer.
in other beers.
So pour
But what I want to do tonight is I want to follow the natural resources of being Newark. And I'm going to do that by telling stories.
Ballantine
There.
Next time you're in your favorite tavern,
love
better
how
make
they're
it
smoking,
Valentine, America's finest since 1840.
It's 1840. So I'm going to tell two stories, and I'm going to trace the natural resources, the ingredients that go into beer. And the first story is going to be about the rise of the beer industry, and the second story is going to be about the fall. And hopefully by the end of it, we'll be able to think a little bit more deeply about why the beer industry collapsed when it did, and get beyond those arguments about prohibition and the Great Depression. They did play a role, but I'm here to hopefully show that there's a little bit more going on than that. So story number one, the rise of the beer industry. And these are the ingredients that I'm going to be looking at. Okay. I want to also say, if you can please interrupt me, I would really appreciate it. I mean that, because me up here just talking, it becomes very one way, and it gets, I think, a little bit less interesting for everybody. So if you don't interrupt me, thank you. Interrupt. You have a hand up, please. That's fantastic. You get an A. So you're asking where the agricultural land was? I'm going to get to it. That's part of that. That's a lot of it is where the land was and where the land went to and where they, yeah. But that's a great question, because you're already ahead of me, which is good. Who else? Great. The unions. Yeah, I don't talk about that. I wish I knew that history. And I should say right now that this audience is both the academic's dream and the academic's nightmare, and I'll explain why. And that's because I know there are people out there who know a lot more about beer and a lot more about Newark than I do. This is really a sort of a side interest. So that's the nervous part, right? That's the nightmare, that I'm not going to know stuff. The dream is that there are so many people here and that there's so much interest. Yep. Why it's so clean, or the role of Newark water? Yes, absolutely. Good. So thank you. Dream and nightmare coming together perfectly. So you're going to interrupt me, and you've already started, and I thank you so much. It makes it such a better talk. So let's start with water. Okay. Water is in beer. It's the most important ingredient in beer. Water is used to soak with the grain to create malt, and the water has to be clean, but it also has to be the right type of water. Spring water has too many minerals in it for good beer. Well water often has the wrong texture. It's too hard. And river water is often considered the perfect source for beer. It's much softer. If you think of Rolling Rock beer or Coors, you see on their labels that those rivers of the rolling water. And it was the same for Newark brewers. The Passaic River was river water that was very good for soaking the grain. Here we see Peter Ballantyne's factory in 1840. Before that, he was up in Albany, but he came to Newark and established his factory right on the Passaic River because of the clean water. He quickly becomes Newark's largest brewery, and 25 other breweries follow him by the mid-1880s. Good, clean water luring brewers to Newark. Let's talk about the malt. Malt is made with grain, in most cases barley, and you mix that malt with water to give the beer its body. Now, in the mid-1800s, the grain market, the barley market in the United States was growing because of all the immigration that was going on. The 1860 census said barley is now used in this country for beer-making purposes. With the rapid increase in our foreign population, there is yearly an increased demand for barley. And in New Jersey, this demand was even more pronounced. In the mid-1800s, the largest crop grown in New Jersey was grain. And barley in particular increased from about 6,000 acres in 1850 to 25,000 acres in 1860. So as the beer industry really grew in Newark, the barley growing in the state of New Jersey also began to go up. And this barley was quite cheap to get. This is just an image from Franklin Township in New Jersey of inspectors looking at the barley here, a much later picture. The reason why this barley was so accessible to the brewers of Newark was because of a transportation revolution that was going on in the city and in the state. So here we see the Morris Canal route, finished in 1831 across the western part of the state, in a sense, allowing the hinterland of Newark, that barley being grown across the state, to get on barges and find its way to Newark. Over on the right-hand side, you see the incline on Raymond Boulevard. I believe that right there is the NJIT parking deck where I park my car like every day. So when I tell my students that they're parking next to this picture, they get really excited. But it wasn't just canals. It was also railroads. We see the Morrison Essex Railroad completed in 1837. Again, a network of rail lines spreading out throughout the state that provided access to that hinterland and that barley. And Ballantyne had his own rail yard. We see it down here. He built the rail yard right into his factory. He could get that barley from the hinterland, bring it right in, mix it with his water to make his malt. And we can see that association of the railroad and Ballantyne beer on the left in this advertisement. We see the engine with its exhaust creating those famous smoke rings. Do we know what they stand for? Purity, body, and flavor. Tony, you get an A+. And we also see the owner of the farm coming, or the tavern, I guess, coming down with mugs full of beer to give to the passengers on the train. So not only did the railroad help the brewers make their product, but they also used that connection to try to promote the product as well. Okay, good. The next, any questions about next ingredient, hops? Hops is added to beer. It's mixed with the malt, and it gives beer that bitter taste. And importantly, it also helps to preserve the beer. So do we know the story about IPA, India Pale Ale? So IPA right now is a trend. It's been a trend for almost a decade. All the young hip people are drinking IPA. The reason it's called India Pale Ale is because the British colonies, the colonists in India, still wanted their beer from Great Britain. But when the brewers in Great Britain sent the beer to India, it took so long to get there, the beer went bad. But they found that if they added more hops to it, it helped to preserve the beer. So the beer could make it all the way to India, which is why we now call it India Pale Ale. But hops is very, very important to Newark brewers. And most of the hops in the 19th century came from upstate New York. Upstate New York in the 1850s produced 90% of all hops in the United States. And in 1857, this county right here, Otsego County, was considered the highest quality hops in America. The county had devoted 2,500 acres to the growing of hops and produced over 200 pounds of hops a year. And Ballantyne used his trains and this network of canals to capture this hops and bring it to Newark. He used 1.5 million pounds of hops per year, most of it from upstate New York. And again, it was cheap because of that transportation network. Okay. I gotta blow my nose. What's this? Oh, good, thank you. I'm sorry. The question was, is the hops industry or agriculture still located in one location? And I said yes, but not upstate New York. It has shifted, which is part of the problem that we'll discuss in the second half. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. I would imagine it was even, I think probably even closer up in Albany. So he probably brought those connections with him. He knew about the hops in upstate New York and then went down to Newark and continued those economic relationships. The question was, Valentine came from Albany, so he must have already had those connections. So I'm sure he did. I want to just talk now about a missing ingredient. Very good. Yeast. Yeast is a missing ingredient, but it was actually brought by one of the first German immigrants. They came with not only their luggage, but some yeast from Bavaria that they actually used to make the beer. So yeast is a good guess, but a very quick answer here. And it's not a natural resource. It's something else that myself as an environmental historian is interested in, because we're not just interested in the natural resources, not just the environment, but also what's the relationship that we're interested in? Nature and man, culture, right? The Germans, thank you. So the other human resource, it's human resource, a human resource that I'm interested in, not just a natural resource. We want to bring the people into this story. So as you can see, I was able to find great little icons for these, but I had to make this one. And I made a little stick figure and I thought, this doesn't really cut it. So I had to add a little more. So there we have the workers. So the workers here are Germans from Newark. And I just want to discuss the growing workforce here. We have, by 1911, several German neighborhoods in Newark, and the numbers just grow. 1835, only 300 Germans. 1850, 3,500, accounting for 10%. And by 1880, 40,000 Germans, accounting for 30% of the population in Newark. And these immigrants came with knowledge about beer making. Here we see Kruger brewery workers on the left and a Ballantine driver on the right. So again, they did bring yeast from Bavaria, but they also brought all this knowledge about how to make beer. And that was incredibly valuable to the brewers. Additionally, they were an incredible market for consumption. So not only did they help make the beer, but the brewers could also then turn around and sell the beer right back to the German people of Newark. And we see that in this article from Harper's that appeared in October of 1876. This is an engraving. It depicts what was then known as Germantown. We can see how they live. But if we examine this engraving as if it was a primary source, just like you would examine a newspaper article or a diary, you can begin to see the beer a little bit, okay? Any ideas about seeing the beer here? Bob? Definitely. Yes, so there were blue laws that tried to restrict the amount of alcohol consumption on Sundays. And in Germany, they just had a different cultural relationship to beer. For them, beer was not something that was immoral and brought you away from your, for instance, your religious community. It was something that joined the community together. So they had beer gardens and they had all different ages together, and they found it to be a very, very social thing. So that created a lot of tension with the native born people in Newark who were very upset by, for instance, this woman over here with a keg, who seems to be haggling with this man about something beer related. But I also think that this right here might be the Hensler brewery stack. It looks, all the breweries had these large towers, and it looks to me like that could be one of them. But the writing that went along with this engraving also really speaks to the role of beer in German culture and how it was quite different than the role of beer in the native-born culture. This was an interesting article. It was written by a woman named Martha J. Lamb, which was pretty rare for this period. And she wrote, "A wondrous tide of Germans has flooded Newark. At noon, you will see women and children running across the street and up and down with pitchers in their hands. They're going for lager beer to drink with their dinners, which is as indispensable as the dinner itself. There are 8 or 10 immense breweries within the district. The preparation of this article, meaning beer, for the market requires incessant and skilled labor." So these were not just workers, unskilled workers. These were skilled workers with a serious knowledge about the product that they were being hired to produce. The result was that because of these skilled and knowledgeable workers, combined with the access to the natural resources, both in Newark, like the Passaic River and its water, but also in Newark's hinterland, its barley and its hops, was that the beer industry in Newark took off and blossomed. So in 1870, the Newark beer industry was the 5th largest industry in the city. And by 1890, it was the 2nd most important industry, but behind leather making, which is really what Newark is known for during this period. Okay. Okay, any questions about the rise? Because we're getting to the fall and it's a less happy story. Okay, just to wrap this up then, it's nature that attracted brewers to Newark. The city had clean water in the Passaic. In its hinterland, it had New Jersey barley that was right next door and high quality hops in New York State. This gave Newark a natural advantage for making beer. Unfortunately, the relationship to those natural resources, the relationship between the city and those natural resources began to change in the early 20th century. And that led to and exacerbated the decline. I'm not trying to argue that this was the only reason the beer industry declined, but this was one of the reasons. All right, so let's now look at these ingredients again and try to see what happens to each of them. Okay, any questions? Yeah, good. In 1899. Yeah, exactly. And I'll explain what this issue, and I'll explain, if you can remind me, when I used to give this lecture to my undergraduates, I didn't know that, and the lecture was very different, and I've understood that more recently, so I had to sort of change things. But it's a really good issue to discuss, and I'm going to discuss water in a second. Okay. Anything else? Good. Okay. Here we go. Let's start with the workers. They're not so happy. Newark's German population begins a pretty precipitous decline in the 20th century. While in the 1880s, there were 40,000 Germans in Newark, accounting for 30%. In 1930, that drops to 12%, or 35,000. 1940 drops to 9.5%, 23,000. And we can see that drop even increasing and becoming worse in the 1950s and the 1960s. As white flight begins to take place, people begin to leave Newark, along with the rise of suburbia. And there are a whole host of reasons for that white flight, from redlining to government programs that encourage certain people to leave Newark and kept other people there. That's for another lecture. But we see this decline in the white population of Newark. Here in this graph, it's the yellow line. So Newark's white population declining and Newark's suburban population going up at the same time. So this is about the rise in Essex County and the suburban towns around there. So a lot of the Germans are leaving Newark and going to the suburbs. The result was that the German population in Newark declined, that skilled labor left the city, took on other jobs, and also it decreased the market for local consumption of beer as well. So we have a worker problem here, a human resources problem. Okay, let's move on to hops. In the early 20th century, the hops industry in upstate New York was hit by a cascade of natural disasters, basically. In 1909, it was hit by blue mold, which crippled many of the crops. 5 years later, an insect arrives. I mean, it's like the end of the world up in Hopsville. An aphid arrived in 1914 that destroyed much of the crops as well. And then in the 1920s, a downy mildew affects the hops also. Part of the reason this was happening is that they planted everything in a monoculture, right? One culture that then becomes much more susceptible to these sorts of diseases. But also, hops is a type of crop that really rips fertility out of the soil very, very quickly. So this region in upstate New York was suffering from a soil fertility problem as well. As a result, by the mid-20th century, it had experienced a 90% decrease in the amount of hops that this region could produce. So basically, the hops industry collapses. And as a result, hops migrates from upstate New York to the West Coast, to Oregon and California. Very far away, very expensive to get back to Newark. And all the good hops, much of the good hops today prides itself on coming from the West Coast. Although I do want to say that there is a rebirth of the hops industry up in upstate New York right now. Hops, workers, hops, let's go to grain, the malt. In 1880, the New Jersey Agricultural Board made an announcement. It said that farmers should stop growing grain. The reason was that there was a rise in grain production in the Midwest, much of it around Chicago, where the land was much, much cheaper, and New Jersey farmers could not compete with those prices and with that land. So instead, the board promoted perishables, like the perishables in this fruit stand and vegetable stand in New York City. The idea was convert your grain into perishables and sell it in the New York City market because you could get it there quickly. The Midwest could not get their perishables there quickly, so the farmers could capitalize on that market while they were being outcompeted regarding grain. And this is part of the reason why New Jersey becomes the garden state, right? I mean, there's sort of a debate about when that term arises, but this is part of that history. So again, these brewers are now having to pay much more for the grain that is out in the Midwest, right, than they were paying before. And now the water issue. This is the one that has caused me the most stress because it's continually evolving as my wonderful history colleagues here in the library and at the Ironbound Community Corporation at New Jersey Historical Society continue to walk in right before my talk and hand me documents. So in the late 19th century, as Newark's economy grows, a lot of these industries continue to dump pollution into the Passaic River, including the breweries. And by 1888, there is real concern over this water issue. This is what the Newark Evening News wrote in June. They wrote the lower portion of the Passaic receives the pollution of 250,000 people and 375 tons of excreta per day. The pollution from factories and other sources is beyond calculation. Truly, this is not water. It is a poisonous drug and reminds me of the words of the old witches of Macbeth. As a result, it's determined that there are 88,000 microbes for every teaspoon of Passaic River water. At the time, it leads to typhoid and other diseases. And in 1925, the Passaic River is deemed unsuitable for drinking. Now, we have to understand that in 1899, the city of Newark buys up land in the Highlands, creates 3 reservoirs, and begins to pipe water down to residents. I have to determine whether the brewers got access to that water. I think it's also important to determine how much they had to pay for that water, because my guess is that it was a much more expensive process for them to get that water. Now, right before I began, George Hawley from upstairs walked in and showed me a document that said that the brewers also dug 800-foot deep wells to get at water below them. So I have to now determine, was that water polluted too? Was there seepage from the pollution into the wells? Did this also affect these brewers? So water is definitely playing a role. I think it's definitely becoming more expensive for these brewers. And it's just one more environmental hindrance to this industry. So I want to conclude by bringing this back to the Pabst Brewery closing. When we think about this event, we have to rethink the event, I think, and understand that it's not only related to the human history of Newark, not only related to Prohibition, not only related to the Great Depression, not only related to serious demographic shifts in the city that were often inequitable. It's also related to Newark's environmental history. It's related to dramatic changes in the city's relationship to the natural resources within the city, like the Passaic River, and the natural resources in its hinterland. So in other words, we went from Newark having a hinterland that was filled with cheap grain, high quality hops, and clean water, to natural resources that were further away, hops in California, resources that were significantly more expensive, that grain from the Midwest, and in the case of water, degraded water and even unusable water. And on top of this, we have the lack of workers. So as a result, I think that the bottle up there being taken down is as much about Newark's nature as it is about Newark's culture. Thanks very much. I just want to show what Nancy Zach brought in for me. I don't know if you're all familiar with Ironbound Voices. It's the newsletter of the Ironbound Community Corporation. This was the front page 7 years after the Ballantine Brewery closed. It shows a ship, the Ballantine ship sinking, and it says it'll be known as Black Friday for all Ballantine workers. So that's pretty amazing.
Are there questions here in the audience to get started? Here, I'll start.
It's more of a comment that there may be a third chapter that's good news in that Newark local beer has come back to Newark right across the park here. So, yeah, oh, good job. Or you could go afterwards.
Tell us all so we can go.
It's right across the park here in the former Verizon building, Walker House. And it's a guy from Montclair who is really making a go of it, doing his own brewing there in a very large hall. And so it'd be great to ask him about his environmental aspects of why he chose it here. Was it about the water?
Yeah.
What was it? And is he trying to use environmentally sustainable practices? So for a reprise for your next talk.
You know, one of my students
Thank you.
did a project on the Anheuser-Busch Brewery and talked also about the rise of craft brewery. And she did a whole section of her report, her final project, on breweries engaging, embracing sustainable practices, both because it's a good thing to do, but also as a way to sell beer responsibly and also as a branding strategy. So I think it is a good positive step and a good positive story.
Let me follow up with one right on that topic. If water was the issue, why is Anheuser-Busch still brewing?
Anheuser-Busch gets its water from the Highlands, not from Newark. And from what I've heard, they're brewing a lot less. They're doing other things in that factory. I don't know any more than that. I'm not really sure why Anheuser-Busch is still there. I mean, it's just such a massive factory. I think they're doing a lot of bottling as well there. So I think that maybe they're using it as either a transfer station or a bottling and maybe doing less brewing there. But I think it's just such a huge infrastructure that it would be hard to just, get rid of it.
Interesting talk. I have a question about the labor force and the white flight out of Newark. Is there any indication as to where the laborers came from? Because Newark is a transportation hub, and presumably some of those people who left Newark could have commuted in for jobs because of the excellent rail system. Do you have any idea where the workers came from, or if they suburbanized?
Were they the workers where they came from or where they left to?
Were they left too, but did they continue to commute back into Newark for jobs in the breweries?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I think that what a lot of immigrants did is as they moved to suburbia, they thought of themselves as also trying to move up. So maybe they left the workforce in breweries and maybe their children professionalized. And as the generations changed over, the younger generation maybe didn't want to be doing work that was so associated with hyphenated Americans being German American, but maybe wanted to become more so-called American. I don't know the answer to that. It's a great question.
Yeah, because that's an interesting question, because then it's not so much the fact that the laborers moved out of Newark, but that people basically changed out of those jobs,
Right.
evolved out of those jobs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I should say that this topic is really less of a research project of mine and more just of an interest. So I'm sorry if I'm not answering your questions as deeply as I could be.
There's a couple of comments here in the chat about, well, the Pabst bottle was originally for Hoffman soda.
Yes, I
Of
did
course,
know
and there are
that.
others saying, I still miss that bottle. Third person saying, me too. But here's a question from your friend Natalie Borsovitz. Unlike the other breweries in Newark, Ballantine was not founded by Germans. Peter Ballantine came from Scotland, but Ballantine was the first and ended up being the last one standing. Why were they able to survive longer than anyone else?
If I had to make a guess, I would say because they were bigger. They lasted longer because they had more market share, maybe had more control over those natural resources. They had their own rail lines, but maybe someone in the audience might know why Ballantine lasted longer. It might have been a worker union issue. It looks like people know, people have their hands up. Can you help me out? I mean, Ballantine was definitely the largest. So I think if the industry was struggling, it could have lasted the longest.
Do you know where the Hoffman and Pabst got their water from? Because I had heard that there was an underground river as opposed to like an aquifer that was tapped by a well.
Right. I mean, as I said, the material I got tonight suggests these 800-foot wells that some of the breweries used. I know that when the breweries first arrived, they used the Passaic River. I think as that got increasingly polluted, they did things like digging wells and then lobbied the city to create those reservoirs in the north. So in the beginning, I think they used local water. And then as the local water became more toxic, they reached into their hinterland to get fresh water. And New York City was doing the same thing with the Croton aqueducts and the Croton reservoirs related to their dirty waters as well. So I'm sorry, I don't know the specifics about that brewery.
But related to that, I mean, Ballantine was along the river, but Kruger and Hensler were not
the
on the
hill.
river.
the
So
hill.
why, if they were from the beginning, did they not get their water from the river, but from wells?
It seems so from the material we've just looked at. And the fact that those wells were 800 feet deep, that's not a shallow well. So they were up on the hill, I believe, and to get all the way down to that water took an enormous amount of capital. And that investment allowed them to produce an enormous amount of water per day. I think it was something like over 40,000 gallons of water a day. And the question then is, how long could that water remain clean and safe before it too might have gotten polluted?
In terms of labor issue, I would really urge you to look at what was happening in terms of the consolidation, buying out of Valentine, the changing in ownership. The reality is Anheuser-Busch goes for many years with labor coming into Newark. One could even looking at it being racist in terms of that blacks can't be working in breweries. The port of Newark is still a very viable workforce, lots of workforces in Ironbound in terms of industry, in terms of the 50s. Ironbound is, a mixture of different ethnic groups. So I just urge you to really look at other things because I think otherwise it starts going down a dangerous road in terms of labor.
I totally agree with you. I mean, there are, multiple stories that you could tell about this topic, right? If you were a labor historian, you could look at the workers and the unions and, sort of the discrimination that was going on with different ethnicities and workers. If you were an immigration historian, you could look at that in a different way. Economic historian, right? I was just trying to sort of uncover this other side to it. And I'm now working on an environmental justice history of the city of Newark in the post-war era. So for me, beer is less a part of that story. And this is sort of an interesting way to think about this one topic, but thank you.
Bill May notes or says, I grew up in Newark Central Ward on Quitman Street, not far from the Kruger Brewery. At certain times during the day, I often saw a large flow of what appeared to be beer being ejected from the brewery that ran down Montgomery Street into the sewer system. Do you know if that was beer or why it was released?
That was not beer, and it was pollution from the brewery being dumped into the sewer. They would not be dumping beer, that's for sure. There's probably used up malt or hops that had been soaked and then they didn't need it, or it wasn't the right formula for the beer and they would just dump it into the streets.
So I just have a comment and a question. So the first is I appreciate your discussion about sources of water. As you probably know, there was a huge, when I work in public health and our big lesson is about cholera outbreak in London and how folks in the brewery didn't get sick because the source of water was different. So I think that that's really, very telling in terms of water sources and what it can do. My other question is about sort of hops and lessons learned from growing hops. So did they take lessons from crop, looking at things like crop rotation and some of the things related to the aphids and things like that when they were growing hops out in other areas?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know what happened out in Oregon and California. I know that the upstate New York people did learn their lesson and are now trying to, as I said before, rejuvenate the hops fields. They're trying to grow them in a patchwork now rather than just in monocultural areas so that they decrease the propensity for insect and disease infestations. And also, unfortunately, I think they're relying on things like pesticides and other toxic chemicals to protect the hops as well. And then there is as well a sort of a movement towards more organic resources as well, along with the craft industry trying to be more sustainable. So I think we have learned a lot. And I think that it might mean that the hops industry in upstate New York could be more sustainable and could last a lot longer and not go through some of those, very difficult, we call them natural disasters, but they're not. I mean, they're human-made disasters. It's because you're planting in a certain way, you're using certain crops, you're, overusing the soil. So the term natural disaster is not really correct.
Neil, by the way, there were about 95 people on the Zoom.
Oh, that's great. Fantastic.
Complimenting the 40 of us.
Thank you
who
so
are
much
here.
on Zoom
Yeah.
for coming. I really appreciate it.
Tara McCormick says Valentine employees were able to drink beer on their breaks. My dad worked there, so a lot of us heard about the employees drinking beer during the course of the day. But Linda Caldwell asks a more a serious question. Do we know if slave labor
No,
was used in the early days of breweries?
I have no idea.
No idea.
No idea. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Um,
Any other questions?
I was wondering if any of these breweries or the companies that ultimately bought them out or then possess the land have taken responsibility, or I guess have been held responsible for any of the pollution of the Passaic,
for what?
for the pollution of the Passaic.
I mean, when I read the Newark Evening News about the problem with the river, the public was very much blaming these industries for it. But we have to remember that a polluted river or polluted skies back in the 1880s was a good thing. It meant economic vibrancy and economic power and economic growth. So Pittsburgh, for instance, called itself Smoke City as a branding mechanism, right? It was to get more industry to come. So the idea back then, I think, was to pollute and then figure out a different sink or a different fix around the problem. So in this case, let's keep polluting, but let's get our water from up in the highlands. And in doing that, if we have to kick people off their land in the highlands to get that water, so be it, because that's what happened. Many landowners lost their land, and many landowners nearby had their land flooded. And that was sort of a sacrifice zone in a different way. We talk about Newark as a sacrifice zone, but all this reaching into the hinterland for these resources, didn't occur in a vacuum. So what happens in Newark affects people living, 50 miles away. So I'm not sure if that answered your question, but I think it gives some perspective.
Neil, thank you for that talk. I have two questions. They may extend beyond the strictly environmental, but of course, environmental is not strict, right?
Yep.
One is that when you spoke about the Ballantine rail yard, you mentioned for the arrival of raw materials, but would it also have been potentially part of a distribution?
Absolutely.
network?
It went both ways.
And the other question is, because I grew up with Mel Allen baseball in Ballantine, and I'm wondering what the role of marketing might have been and whether
Yeah.
Ballantine lasted longer for that reason.
The only marketing research I did was to look through those ads, those great 1950, 1960s clips, so that I could try to figure out how they were promoting the beer and how I, as an environmental historian, could talk about it. But in looking at the Ballantine ads, it really seems that they're setting that beer often within an agricultural landscape where you see sort of farms associated with the beer. So Ballantine at least seems to be very conscious of the fact that they are linking their product with the natural environment. They're trying to draw the connections very directly between that factory here and the hinterland or the hops fields even out in Oregon, right? That image in the in the clip was, I don't think, was a barley field in New Jersey. It looked much further west than that. And that was 1960, so that would make sense.
And Neil, there have been questions about how the beer was distributed and such. And Bob Russo talks about his family's distribution firm. He says he grew up in the 50s, so he's not sure how beer was sold before that, but his father worked for the Ballantine Brewery as a salesman all over New Jersey and then took over from Bob's grandfather with the distribution business. And he recalls delivering mostly to homes throughout Newark and the suburbs. They would be wooden boxes of 24 bottles and then cardboard boxes in the 60s and 70s. And then cases of canned beer, so bottle collection declined. But families in Vailsburg and South Orange were on his father's Saturday route. Also numerous private social clubs in the North Ward Italian neighborhoods and bars all over downtown. So
yeah, it was like the milkman, right? I think locally, people signed up and had their beer delivered, just like the milkman. So I really think that's an interesting personal story. But on a broader level, I mean, what Newark did with its transportation network was going west from Newark. There was not just the Morrison Essex Railroad, but there were many railroad spurs that went out like a fan into New Jersey's hinterland, but even beyond into Pennsylvania, connecting up to Chicago. They were fan lines, and they were the ones that could funnel natural resources to Newark for beer making. And then Newark could fill up those same railroad cars with bottles and cans of beer and send them back out into the hinterland. But from Newark to New York City, they had what were called trunk lines, single lines that went right into the biggest market in the entire region. So it was a combination of fan railroad lines and trunk lines with Newark in the middle that worked beautifully for both obtaining the natural resources necessary for beer and then funneling the product out to consumers through this intricate rail network.
George, did you have a question? Do you want-
A couple comments. One related to your discussion of how embedded beer drinking was in the German community. Father Curley, who's the librarian at St. Benedict's, was sharing some information he had from the parish records that one of the regular items was beer for the nuns.
Was it a daily
Yeah,
occurrence? Or-
yeah, absolutely. It was just
Yeah.
like, you just had it with your meals,
Right,
like, yeah, right. They were
Right.
German nuns. Yeah,
Right.
absolutely, right. And then also I live in Newark and I grow hops in my yard. So if there are any local brewers who want some local Newark grown hops, get in touch.
I was in Germany 3 summers ago, and we went to a monastery that made the best beer I've ever tasted in Bavaria. So it's still going on. Yeah, unbelievable.
By the way, that blue laws was a 19th century phenomenon. In the colonial period, the Puritans were perfectly happy to with cider
Really?
and with beer. That
Huh.
was because it was safer than drinking the
Right,
water in
drinking
many
water.
cases. So that was more of a 19th century thing than
Interesting.
a 17th or 18th century.
Yeah.
Peter Tannen asks a question. Passaic is tidal, and
Yeah.
did they have to time
Yeah.
the periods of the day when they could draw all the water out versus
Yep.
the brackish water and so?
One of the problems with the Passaic during this time was that before there was industry along it, it flooded and then tidal changes occurred, and that helped to flush the river of its toxins. As industry built along it, they, in a sense, channelized the river and wouldn't allow that flushing to occur. And that kept the pollution stuck in the river, and it went into sediment at the bottom of the river. And that was one of the problems. Not only did they pollute the river, but they changed its physical structure through the built environment to limit the amount of rejuvenation that the water in that river could accomplish. So, yeah, really good question. Were they brewing it right there? Yeah. I mean, I think that this is something that we're seeing everywhere. People are really excited about local food and local beer. But I think what's interesting in Newark is you see a lot of these craft beer makers relying on the history and using the deep history of beer making in Newark to, help resuscitate the industry. So history is working economically for them. And I think that Ballantine is now brewing again, not in Newark, but I tried to get some to bring and put on I couldn't find it, but yeah. I'm sure there were, especially during Prohibition. Yeah, but not, I don't know, I'm sorry. Yep. Yeah.
When do you?
The more we look at that picture and the more you talk about the problems with the river, I have to ask, do you actually have any proof that they ever took water out of the river?
No. No. But I just want to say this is not like my research. This is, so that's what I would do. When George Hawley walked in and gave me a document 5 minutes ago about these wells, it made me start to rethink. I can't imagine that Peter Ballantyne came here in 1840 and dug an 800-foot well. There's no way. I mean, he's beginning by using the river. I would find it hard to believe he had the capital to come from Albany and create a small brewery and then begin to use the river right away. But that is research to be done for sure. Yeah. That's the nightmare. That's the nightmare, right? That's the nightmare question.
Arnold, another question?
The major environmental impact of Valentine that I remember is just the horrible stink of anywhere in that area.
Yeah, we should remember it's not just water pollution that is a side effect of these industries, right? It's also polluting the air and even some toxics that are in Newark that are linked to the brewing industry as well. I just want to, if I can address that question again, I shouldn't have said no, because there are, I have read accounts where multiple historians have said that these brewers came to Newark because of the clean Passaic River water. So I haven't seen a primary source that says that, but there are multiple scholars and commentators who are saying that the Passaic River was what lured them here. So I think I probably misspoke a little bit before. So
Harrison Chu asked, when is this going to be posted? In a few days on YouTube, the Newark History Society channel, all our programs, at least since 2008, are posted there. Beth Zach Cohen, as soon as we get the recording of her, then she posts it, and so then I get out an email. If you aren't on the Newark History Society website, send a note to Newark History SOC, S-O-C, Newark History SOC @gmail.com, and I'll add you to the list. Peter Tannen, who asked about the brackish water, said, what is this beautiful room where the program is taking place? And those of us who love the Newark Public Library and Centennial Hall are glad to have a meeting here in this place again. So, Warren, did you have a question or comment?
Although the beer industry in Newark was declining in the 20th century, it had a tremendous rebirth at the end of World War II, when of all the cities in the country, Anheuser-Busch put up their plant in Newark, hired hundreds and hundreds, eventually a couple of thousand workers in Anheuser-Busch. And I wonder what water they used, because by that time, no one would use the Passaic River.
not local water, definitely not local water for sure. And I just also want to give a shout out to Beth Zach Cohen, who's in the audience too, for helping my students and also myself for a lot of the research. Thank you very much.
Let's see, I was looking in the chat rather than the Q&A. So there's another source here. Let's just see if we can. Nell Painter says you answered the question. Dan O'Flaherty.
No Painter, that's great. Thank you for tuning in. She's a hero.
Dan O'Flaherty, who is one of our founding members as well, and is an economic professor at Columbia, takes an economics perspective of this. So as you say, there are different ways of looking at it. Dan is saying that perhaps another way of looking at that is that resources have become a lot cheaper over time. Beer is low value, high weight. There are increasing returns to scale in manufacturing it. With trucks, you don't need as many plants. And look at where the Anheuser plants are. There are about 10 in the country, fairly evenly spread. If resources are the key, you don't do it this way. If transportation of the product is key, then you spread like Anheuser does. But that's essentially what you were saying, the difference between the 19th century and the 20th century.
And it's just so interesting that an economic historian can see things that, I'm not seeing. And if we get multiple stories, we can begin to piece them together and get a much, much fuller picture. So I think what we need to do is have a conference on beer in Newark and invite people from all different fields, invite local workers, people whose parents worked in the beer industry, and just get these multiple perspectives and multiple stories so we can understand it, not just from the top down, like I'm doing right as an academic, but from the bottom up. Let's hear from the people who worked in these industries and their family members and their memories, and really get at those oral accounts as well.
And Nell Painter goes to Linda Caldwell-Epps' question about the possibility of enslaved labor. And she suggests that in the 19th century, the beer industry would not have employed unfree workers, that enslaved New Jerseyans were at work through the Civil War era, but more likely in agriculture in central Jersey. Again, slavery was gradual emancipation started in 1804, but those of a certain age remained enslaved through the Civil War in declining numbers, but Nell is suggesting more in agricultural situations.
And I would also think that the skilled German workers would be very resistant to training slaves to do those jobs as well.
Yeah. So I think that's it. Are there another question there?
I just want to so happy that you're doing this for us, because a lot of people didn't know that Newark is a historical city, and it's known for a lot of things, a lot of good things, not only the airport and stuff, but I didn't know there were so many beer companies in Newark.
Yeah.
So do you think that they'll ever have another one
Another beer company?
here in Newark? You think?
I think we're gonna have a lot of craft beer companies. But
Craft
I
beer?
think what's so great in what you're saying is that, often Newark is remembered for less positive things. And I think that what this society does and what we're all doing is really changing that narrative and really trying to look at it in a much more complex way. The city has a much longer history than that. That history is both positive and negative. It has great aspects to it and difficult aspects to it. But as long as we explore all of them, we can really cherish the place that we're in and have a connection to it. And I think help it become a better place for everybody, if you know what I mean.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Neil. Right on time. This has worked out splendidly. I would just say for those watching and here, the next Newark History Society event is on Tuesday, May 24th. Bob Vitrogowski of the Rutgers Medical School, who's done a lot of work about Dr. Harrison Martland. Some of you know about the Radium Girls story about those poor girls who painted watch dials and licked the paintbrush in between. He's the one who did the research on that, among other things. So May 24th, 6 o'clock here again in Centennial Hall. Of course, those of you who are on the Newark History Society mailing list will certainly hear about that. But again, Neil, thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.